Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps TV show. This episode came out in season 3. It was written by Dan Angel and Billy Brown and directed by Ron Oliver. And the episode in question is Say Cheese and Die Again. Now I have here the DVD copy of Say Cheese and Die, but if you turn it over on the back, you see Say Cheese and Die Again. So this episode here is a quite infamous episode from the original Goosebumps television show, and it's quite touted to be one of the worst, if not the worst episode of the entire show for a lot of folks. And I have to say, I've hated this episode for many years. I've hated it, and I kind of convinced myself, in recent memory, that maybe it's not as bad as the book. Maybe it's a little bit better. Maybe it's a little more memorable. But no. I actually sat down and rewatched it. And I got well versed into how much of a crap storm this episode really was. And it's baffling to me because Dan Angel and Billy Brown, the two head writers of the show, wrote the script of this adaptation. And you had Ron Oliver, of all directors. I couldn't see anybody else, honestly, making this, maybe minus Rick Drew, but still, how did we get so far removed from these three being associated with great episodes? Ron Oliver did direct the original Say Cheese and Die episode, so it's fitting that he directs the follow-up to Say Cheese and Die Again. I get it. But holy crap, man. What happened? And this is one of those episodes that you can clearly tell that they had to find some workarounds to adapt the source material, and they tried to expedite it with those changes and adaptations to fit a 22-minute time crunch, but they only did half the assignment right, I feel. And they kept the sins of the book that made it unlikable and dragging down the entire story in their episode counterpart, which drags the episode down and perhaps makes it even worse given the visual elements that we're forced to sit through in this episode. This episode is a big old piece of crap, in my opinion. It is a big old piece of crap. You do not need to watch this episode unless you are a diehard Goosebumps fan and you want to experience everything that the franchise has to offer. Of course, at some point, you're going to have to go through this. And this is the only other interpretation we have of Greg Banks in his sequel follow-up to his first original outing in the first Say Cheese and Die. So if you're a big Greg Banks fan or Say Cheese and Die fan, you're almost forced to kind of experience this to get one last hurrah with him. But even then, good riddance. Good riddance after this episode. I think this episode possibly tarnished Greg Banks' legacy forever. And I don't blame why Stein didn't bring him back in the Horrorland sequels. And I'm shocked he didn't bring back Evan Ross, but I think those sequels did enough damage to his character not to want to bring him back. So, good riddance. He deserves it, especially after this episode. So, yeah, without further ado, let's talk about it. There's going to be some spoilers about the story. If you haven't experienced the episode before, I advise that you click off, go watch the episode, and then come back for my review. It will help you out better in that way. So the episode starts off very different from the book. We get pretty much thrown into a dream sequence where Greg Banks, the main character from the first episode, is asleep in his bed at night, and he's being plagued by this figure coming into his room holding this camera that we saw in the first Say Cheese and Die installment, which is causing Greg to, wake up in a pool of sweat, essentially, and be petrified that this camera's kind of haunting his dreams. Well, we get caught up to speed, possibly as to why he's having a nightmare, because he's in class isolated by himself, unlike the book, where in the book counterpart, he's given this book report in front of everyone. He's just by himself with Mr. Sauer, I guess, after class, so they cut that whole part of the story out. But he's sitting there waiting anxiously to have Mr. Sauer read over his book report about this evil camera that he came across, and he recounts his story in his writing, and Mr. Sauer looks over at Greg and says, I said the assignment has to be a true story. This is completely made up. This is pretty much crap. I'm going to have to fail you. And Greg is, of course, panicked because in this version of the story, he wants to go to summer camp. And he's like, look, Mr. Sauer, I need an A on this assignment. I need to pass this class because I want to go to summer camp. And Mr. Sauer, like the book, except a little more extra here. He decides to say, you know what, Greg, fine, I'll float your fancy. If you can prove to me that this camera is real, I'll change your grade. So Greg is like, what? What do you mean? He's like, go get the camera and bring it back to me and prove that it's evil, and I'll pass you. So Greg's like, okay, well, in this version, we don't have all of his friends like we do in the book, and Greg decides to do this mission solo, and he realizes that this is going to have to be something he's going to handle himself. So he heads back to the same warehouse district, or I guess this old closed off portion in this version of Pitt's Landing in the episode. It's more like a derelict, closed off fenced area of these old buildings, like I guess a factory where I guess the owner used to live in it or something. It's really, I don't really know what they're trying to go for. Maybe it's old like shanty homes or something. But when Greg gets there, the building is torn down. And when he goes over to the area where the basement was, he kind of falls into the door a little bit and these bats fly out in that crappy CGI type of way. And he ends up wandering down the basement stairs, unlike the book where it was just an empty pit of nothing and all the contents were taken out and thrown in the garbage. Well, when Greg goes down into the basement, he looks over after knocking some glass onto the floor and sees the camera resting on a table. But Greg is stopped by this individual with a ponytail who I guess is the new owner of the property, because there was a for sale or I guess a foreclosure sign outside. And he's like tired of these kids trying to sneak into this area, and he's been having this problem for a while and wants Greg to give him the camera. But Greg, knowing what the camera can do, takes a picture of the man and runs off back up the basement stairs to head out and escape. And we see something like an accident happen to this gentleman, and we see the photo develop, and it turns out that it's predicting the future, like the first episode kind of laid out. So when Greg gets back home with the camera, he has an interaction with his mom, and his mom's like, how'd you do on your assignment? And he's like, I need to do some more research and blah, blah, blah. And his brother Terry heads off to work, and Greg takes his camera up into his room, and he decides to hold on to it for the night because he knows that he's going to have to, show it to Mr. Sauer the next following day. So what ends up happening is before Greg can do so, he ends up bumping into his friend Sherry, who we saw in the first episode. I think she's played by the same actress. And Sherry notices that Greg has the camera. And she's panicked, and she's like, Greg, why'd you go back and get the camera? And he explains himself, saying that Mr. Sauer was going to fail him if he doesn't show proof of the camera. And in their disagreement, he accidentally takes a photo of Sherry, and Sherry immediately takes the camera and takes a picture of Greg. Well, when they look at their photos, Sherry's photo is a negative, and Greg's photo shows him kind of gaining weight. And he's like, well, I don't know what to think of this. This is bizarre and weird. And when he goes to class, later on, it's revealed that Mr. Sauer isn't there, and he's going to have to come back the next day with the camera. So he goes home, and he wakes up the next morning, and he notices that he's starting to balloon like a tick. Because, like the book counterpart, he's supposed to gain weight and become obese, essentially. So after stalling his mom, and after going through a whole montage of him trying on clothes and seeing the iconic shot of him screaming no with this terrible weight gaining effects going on in this mirror shot of him, he heads to school with these baggy clothes, and Mr. Sauer doesn't even recognize him. And when he says that he's Greg and he's brought this camera to prove to him that the camera exists, Mr. Sauer, humiliates him in front of everybody and pulls up his shirt, and there's like a shot of a big guy's gut. And Mr. Sauer thinks it's a fat suit, and all the kids laugh at him and look at the camera like it's some toy. And he's like, well, I got some photos to show you. And he's like, you know what? Stop pulling my chain, Greg. You're getting an F, right? So Greg gets down to the same conclusion like he does in the book, except it's a little bit different here because there's some scenes cut out to expedite the story. But nonetheless, Greg ends up finding his friend Sherry, who looks sickly and ill, and she's been losing weight. And the two of them converse, and they think that what's happening to them is a result of the camera. And they need to find a solution quick before Greg gets too big and before Sherry pretty much withers away and turns to bone. So they come up with this idea that they think would work, because I don't think they even go over the ripping up the photos aspect in this version. I think they just cut that part out to erase the convolution that the book had. So they go straight to asking Greg's brother for help to develop the photos into a positive and a negative to reverse the effects, right? And they end up at the camera store, and time's ticking for them, and they're awaiting the results of the brother, messing with the photos. And we see Greg getting bigger and bulging out of his pants and ripping it. And Sherry's skin is, morphing slowly down until all you see is the outline of her bones and her skin and whatnot. It's really gross. And once we get caught up to speed of, Terry developing these photos, we get an immediate answer this time of what's going to happen to Greg and Sherry, let's just say. And then the ending comes around where we get caught up to speed on what Greg is doing now with the camera, and he's decided to take it back to Mr. Sauer's class one last time to kind of prove his point, saying, hey, look, I was big, now I'm small again, blah, blah, blah. And he goes up to his teacher one last time to try to plead his case, and there's a twist that happens that you don't necessarily see coming, involving an accident, but one particular person finally sees the reality of the situation, let's just say, and that's all you need to expect at a Say Cheese and Die Again's episode. So, off the bat, this episode just flat out sucks. This episode sucks. It's hard to find real redeeming qualities in it, but I do have 3. They're not saving graces because they aren't capitalized on enough in the episode, but the things here that I appreciate do stick out, and I will mention them here. The first thing I really like about this episode version of Say Cheese and Die Again is the opening, and implying that Spidey's perhaps haunting Greg. I think this is a cool shakeup and angle that was not prevalent in the book, and there are some cool aspects that Ron Oliver puts into the directing of the episode, like using flashback shots to kind of highlight possibly that Spidey's still lurking around somewhere and haunting Greg and might still be behind all this. So that creates a level of intrigue, and I really wish they stuck to that lane and just made something completely new out of it with using Spidey again, but I digress. I like the first opening bits to the episode and all the implications of Spidey throughout the story, so I thought that was neat. I will say this, the utilization of Spidey's lair, his former lair in the basement, I thought was a creepy scene. It doesn't replace how iconic the nail in the foot scene is in the book to me, but I thought that was pretty tense. So, the episode does have its tense moments here and there. And I'm going to be upfront. I actually really like Mr. Sauer and his performance in the story. Yeah, he's toned down from how mean he is in the book a little bit, but his personality is a little more on full display, and what they do with him in the ending, I think, helps sell the moral of the story, if it has one, about revenge a little bit. Or I guess in this case, accidental revenge, because it cuts that note out from the book counterpart of Greg in some ways. But yeah, I think the ending is absolutely iconic. And that's the one thing that I think sticks with me the most every time I think about this episode, other than everything else that's completely horrid about it. But aside from those positives, this episode is a big old hunking turd, all right? The acting is some of the worst acting in Goosebumps. I'm not saying that Greg Banks is new actor, because, Ryan Gosling played Greg in the first episode. Obviously, they recasted him, but I think they kept everybody else from the episode, which I thought was strange. But, yeah, Ryan Gosling, I guess, was too busy having an actual career to make this follow-up, so they recasted him. He wasn't terrible, but oh my lord, the material and I guess the shots they went with this kid, I just don't think that helped him whatsoever. And oh my lord, man, the effects in this episode are atrocious. They're absolutely atrocious. When we get down to, the initial effects where Ron Oliver's trying to distort the camera because Greg's not quite in that fat suit yet that they put on this kid. But holy crap, that stuff looks awful. It looks absolutely awful. And you still have the mean-spirited nature of Greg being tormented and all of that. And that's awful. And I think it's even worse here, even though they cut out extra bullying scenes that the book had that are even more distasteful. In this version, they don't even have the relatable monologue that Greg has to kind of compensate for that. So it feels mean for the sake of being mean. And when it comes down to the changes they went with early on, there's potential with keeping Spidey in the loop and possibly having him be an actual villain of the story. But no, he gets dropped as soon as Sherry comes in the story, and then we go right into the book shenanigans. And I'm just like, why are we going down this? This should have been a shoo-in as a clear, complete rewrite for the show. But no, they kept all the sins from the book and they just truncated them down, and they added some, I guess, Ron Oliver-isms and some more humor to kind of bring it out a bit better and make it a little more funnier. But in that unintentional, ironic way. It's not intentionally funny whatsoever. And it's borderline cringe at times. And I'm going to say this. The liberties they take here, right? They cut out the context about having to keep, the photos on Greg's person to use as evidence. They get rid of that part, right? So the whole ripping up the photos, excuse you had from the book is not here. Greg just wants to show that the camera is this big old, because the TV show camera is way different than the book counterpart. It's like this big old futuristic looking thing. That this thing isn't somehow supernatural or linked to the supernatural, right? He just thinks that is the answer instead of the photos, which makes it even dumber. Because if you know that these photos are bad, why not immediately tear them up? Because that's what you did in the first episode. It's just stupid. It's so stupid. And even then, getting down to the other stuff, right? I was willing to kind of suspend mild disbelief, at least when I was reading the book. I didn't bring this up in the review, but I'll talk about it here. I was willing to kind of give myself a little bit to the madness about having this different mechanism unfold with like the negatives and stuff like that. But in the book, it was treated a little bit differently because it took some time to develop on these characters and morph. In the episode, they treat it like, it's just any old thing like Sherry disappearing. And once they, find themselves out of the situations, they're instantly fixed. And I'm just like, oh, well, that's that, I guess. Like, why do you need this to be an element in the story then? They literally kept it in so they can do a shot in the climax of a fat suit Greg that they put on this poor kid. Look at this fat suit they put on this kid. They really just wanted to use that still so they can have him breaking through his pants and showing that Sherry's turning to bone, which I guess is a creepy idea, and I think that's honestly, a little bit creepier than anything that happened in the book, I should say. But why? It's so dumb. It's so dumb, and it's so poorly executed, right? And that just leaves me with, like, my final thoughts on this episode, because I really have nothing else to say about it. I can go on and kind of beat it over the head, but I'm just going to say this. This episode's a piece of crap, man. It's not only a poor follow-up to the episode version of Say Cheese and Die, but if you put this up there with all the installments of Say Cheese and Die and all the interpretations out there, this, I think, barely eclipses what happened with the 2023 show, because at least here, the story involves the camera. We actually have a camera involved in the story. So I value that a little more than what we got in 2023. But still, the 2023 show did way better stuff with the camera than this did. So in a lot of ways, I kind of prefer 2023's interpretation of Say Cheese and Die over this episode of Say Cheese and Die again. And I hate that episode. So that should tell you that this is, I don't think quite to the bottom of the bottom in Goosebumps, but this is just a train wreck. And the fact that Dane Angel and Billy Brown and Ron Oliver were all attached to this, and they somehow fumbled the bag this hard. I think this was the biggest fumble, maybe next to My Harry's Adventure, for an obvious, complete rewrite that they just didn't entertain. And that's why we get these quote-unquote disaster piece or just flat-out horrible episodes in the show. And this episode, I think, is one of the key episodes that almost killed all excitement for the production company. Because I've read the Viewer Beware book and the interviews of people behind the scenes. a lot of people that worked on this specific episode mentioned that they really didn't want to do this one. The studio forced them to make this, and Scholastic forced them to make this one. They really didn't want to do it, so they felt like they kind of half-assed it, and it really does show the lack of enthusiasm. And I guess this was the eye-opening part for a lot of the creators that, you know, the writing was on the wall. They're going to start having to do sequels and kind of retread former ground, and they just weren't interested in doing that. They just wanted to do new content all the time. But being an adaptation show, that's pretty much the cost of the limitations there, is just frustration and being, you know, fumed and, you know, worn out about it. But nonetheless, if I had to rate Say Cheese and Die Again from a 0 to 5 star basis, it doesn't sound like the problems are that damning, but when you really sit down and look at this episode, it's a horrible looking episode. It's not well shot. It's not coherent whatsoever to really tie to the first episode, for that matter, all that much, other than you have reoccurring characters and a very loose plot of, you know, getting these characters on board. And while that was a cop-out more in the book, you don't really feel it as well here because they skip over a lot of context with it. So it just comes across like a confusing mess early on, and then it just spirals into the bad taste territory and the silly gag humor stuff that has horribly aged and has pretty much become a living meme. And it's not a good thing. And minus like those few redeeming things like Mr. Sour and the ending and maybe some implications with Spidey that went nowhere, this episode's a complete wash. So I deducted off the top from 5, 3.5 off for all those issues, and I gave this a 1.5 out of 5 stars, which is a flat F. This is a terrible episode. One of the worst things I've ever seen out of Goosebumps. Maybe not top 10, but pushing it. So take that for what you will. Yeah, this episode's horrible. You can easily skip this episode and not miss a beat. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on Say Cheese and Die Again's episode, I should say. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.